Flint, please come on up. Here's the gentleman you really came to hear. So let me call up here. Wait a minute. Don't overdo it. That just goes to his head. Are you on?
I don't know, can you hear me back there?
Loud and clear.
Okay, very good. It's always a thrill for me to give a talk like this, especially because I never know how many or if anybody's going to show up. My early days as an author, I would give talks, and there were at least 2 occasions when the only people there to hear me were me and my wife. So it's always a relief to see other people in front of me. Today, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about my presentation today. I'm glad nobody brought any children because it's really not appropriate for kids, although the history lesson is probably important for them to know about. Some of the slides are a little bit graphic. I first got interested in Buchenwald back in the early 2000s. How many of you have ever been to Dachau near Munich? Okay, about half of you. For the longest time, Dachau was about the only former concentration camp that Americans and other people around the world could visit. Buchenwald was behind the Iron Curtain for many years until, maybe I should take a little side trip and visit it. And I was really blown away to the extent that I ended up writing 3 books about the camp. Actually, one of them, of the 3, is a memoir of a Frenchman who was imprisoned there. And he allowed me to edit his book. He self-published it in French. I don't speak any French, but we had some translators who worked on it with me, and we were able to put it together. So I have a few copies of the trilogy that are here in case you're interested in those. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the Nazi concentration camp system, what it was, where it was, what it was all about. Why were the camps built in the first place? Primarily, they were built to incarcerate dissidents and opponents to Nazi rule. And these was a broad group of communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, Roma, otherwise known as gypsies, Jews, and so-called asocials. These were people that the Hitler regime felt were a threat to their rule in Germany, and so they wanted to get rid of them, not to kill them, but to put them away in camps and hopefully re-educate them. This gives you an idea of the spread of the camps around Europe. The red dots are the main camps. The black dots are the sub-camps. So every main camp had several, might have been a half dozen, might have been hundreds of sub-camps. The U.S. Holocaust Museum has identified over 42,000 camps that the Nazis had. If you've ever seen Schindler's List, you know that the inmates from a concentration camp were working at Schindler's enamel factory, and that would be an idea of a sub-camp. Could be just a few small numbers, or it could be hundreds or thousands. I want to talk about Buchenwald, and you see the letters KL, that stands for Konzentrationslager Buchenwald, KL. Sometimes if you're driving around Germany and you're near Dachau, you'll see some signs too, KZ Dachau. Well, it's the same thing, but for some reason at some point KL became KZ. To give you an idea of where it's located, it's southwest of Leipzig, Berlin's up here, And the Iron Curtain used to, come down across the eastern part of Germany, which is why it wasn't accessible until recently to those from the west. And the town of Weimar, it's located about 5 miles west of Weimar on top of a hill, and it was covered with trees so it wouldn't be seen by the people in Weimar. Weimar is a very beautiful and ancient city. This is some photos I took on one of my visits there in downtown Weimar. This is the town square. They had a farmer's market going that day we were there. Some of the buildings around the square are really beautiful and well kept. And it's famous for a number of very famous people. Probably the most notable one is Johann Goethe, who wrote the play Faust. Some of you may have heard of Faust. And this is Goethe's house where he lived just off the main square there. And there were a number of other prominent individuals. Johann Sebastian Bach lived there from 1708 to 1717. And two of his sons, Friedemann Bach and Philipp Emanuel Bach, were born in Weimar as well, though his sons were also composers. Another listing here, Friedrich Schiller, a guy who wrote William Tell, was living in Weimar. Franz Liszt, the pianist and composer, lived there for a while. Karl Maria von Weber, another composer, was from Weimar. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great philosopher, was there. Hans Christian Andersen lived there for a while. And Walter Gropius, who founded the Bauhaus School of Architecture, was also a resident of Weimar. So a lot of very prominent individuals spent time there, and it gave Weimar the title of the cultural capital of Germany. It also had a dark side. This is the State Theater at Weimar, and within this building is where the Weimar Constitution was written in 1919 after the First World War. And this was an attempt to make Germany a more democratic society and give it a parliamentary style of government. The Kaiser, the king of Germany, had abdicated, and so this was the Allies' attempt to try and bring Germany into the league of other nations in Europe. This is a shot of the square in Weimar. I showed you a picture of this beautiful building over here. This big white building is called the Elephant Hotel, and this is a shot of it in the 1930s. Hitler liked to come there and stand on the balcony and address the throngs in the street. You can tell that he was a very popular personality at that particular time. After the Nazis came to power in 1933, the Reichstag, the parliament in Germany, which was under the control basically of the Nazi Party, established a group of laws that were lumped together called the Nuremberg Laws. And these basically started coming down hard on some of these groups that I mentioned earlier that the Nazis were particularly unhappy with. And to incarcerate them, they built the concentration camp at Dachau in March of 1933. Hitler had come to power in January, at the end of January of 33. So it didn't take very long to establish the first concentration camps. In 1937, about 4 years later, construction would begin on the camp at Buchenwald. There's a shot of me on one of my trips over there in front of the main gate. The first barracks were built by the SS. After they put up the initial barracks and got their first load of prisoners in, it was the prisoners' job to build the barracks, and they basically did most of the construction at the camp. It gives you an idea of the layout of the camp. All of these long rectangular buildings are barracks. I'll show you a couple of other things. This is the main gate right here. But who's in charge at Buchenwald? The first commandant was a SS colonel named Karl Otto Koch, and he had been the commandant at Sachsenhausen, which is a big concentration camp outside of Berlin. And so the people who made such assignments in the SS thought he would be a good one to run the new camp at Weimar. While he was still at Sachsenhausen, he met a young lady, a redhead named Ilse Köhler. And Ilse, I guess you could say, had a reputation as a girl who knew how to have a good time. And she was quite flirtatious. She really liked men in SS uniforms. And so she and Karl Otto Koch began a relationship. He was recently divorced. Here's Ilse on the left, Karl Otto in the middle, and their dog Afra. Karl had a son from his first marriage named Manfred. You can tell Manfred is not really happy about this relationship. He's probably not even happy that the dog has moved over to his father's side. And so they were married at Sachsenhausen on May 29th, 1937, just shortly before he got his transfer to Buchenwald. This was the administration building at the camp. This was his office. He's got a bust of Adolf Hitler there behind his desk. At the camp, after the whole top of this hill called the Ettersberg was very forested, and there's a palace there, and it was kind of a royal hunting grounds and everything. They took down most of the trees, but they left this one tree that was called the Goethe oak, and it was said that this is where Goethe would go and sit and get inspiration for his plays and books that he was writing. And the legend was that Germany would exist as long as the Goethe oak existed. Well, we'll see what happens about to that. This is another schematic of the camp. This is the main gate. There's the clothing warehouse here. There's a camp kitchen. There was a disinfection area there. The crematorium is here. They had a zoo there. I'll talk about the zoo in a little while. And the Appellplatz, which is the roll call square. Every morning and every evening, all the prisoners had to line up outside, no matter what the weather was, and have a roll call made. And it was also a time to abuse the prisoners who hadn't had enough abuse already that day. Along comes Kristallnacht, which took place November 9th and 10th, 1938. One of the instigators was Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, who said, basically, we need to crack down on the Jewish population, get them to leave Germany, if at all possible, make life really miserable for them. And so during that 2-day period or 1-night period, such things as the burning of synagogues took place, and the rounding up of Jews, the boycotting of Jewish-owned stores took place. And generally, this is the start of the persecution that ended in the Holocaust. In November of 38, right after Kristallnacht, you can see tens of thousands of men who have been rounded up and shipped off to Buchenwald, standing in ranks. They're all wearing their civilian clothes at this point. They've got overcoats on because it was cold, and soon they would be issued basically cotton pajamas. That would be their standard uniform. This is the uniform. They had they had triangles, and the triangles were different colors. They would also, in many cases, have a symbol that indicated what their country of origin was. So N would stand for Norway. So these were Norwegian prisoners who were sent to the camps. This is a shot of roll call, which is known as Appell. We probably have Koch, one of these people out here. Over here, you can see the crematorium. There's some smoke coming out of it. one of the guard towers, and you can see all of the men in ranks there. They were required to stand at attention for hours on end. If they collapsed, then the guards came over and beat them. It was a very hostile environment, as you might imagine. This is a shot of what it looks like today. This is the Appellplatz, the main gate, the crematorium, and the clothing warehouse. All of the barracks have been torn down. They were so pestilential that it was dangerous to public health to keep them up. A nice aerial view of the camp. These are the prisoner barracks, the Appellplatz, crematorium, the zoo. The main gate is right there. The SS barracks were arranged in a semicircle. The quarry is down here. The officers lived in homes here. And this is a factory, and we'll talk more about that, called the Gustavswerk 2, number 2. Most of the concentration camps had this familiar phrase, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. Buchenwald had something different. Their gate had Jedem das Seine on it, which means, roughly translated, and Heidi, maybe you can help me out, it basically means everybody gets what he deserves. Is that close enough? And in 1939, Life magazine had a 2-page photo essay about Buchenwald. And obviously this was before the U.S. got into the war, but it gave people, readers of Life magazine, a look behind the barbed wire, and enabled people to get an understanding of what was going on in the camps. This is a shot of some of the first barracks. These are very substantial buildings. This is the same scene when I took this picture a few years ago on one of my visits. From the guard tower, the main gate, this is kind of the view that one had towards the clothing warehouse and the kitchen. Like I said, all of these barracks have since been taken down, and so this is basically the same view. Whenever new prisoners came in, they had to be first dunked into the disinfection pool to kill any lice or other critters that might be on them. This is a view of the parade ground at the SS barracks. This is the view today. It's been turned into a parking lot, and these are administration buildings for the people who run the camp as a memorial these days. This is Karl, Otto, and Ilse Koch's residence being built. This is the commandant's house. Those are prisoners that are doing the construction work. That's what it looked like when it was all done, and this is what it looks like today. Just the basement floor basically is left. Ilse developed a love for horseback riding, and so she asked her husband if he could build an indoor riding arena so she could ride on inclement days. And so he put the prisoners to work building this. This is what it looked like inside and what it looks like today. Not a lot left. In 1939, September 1st, we all know that Germany invaded Poland, and the European phase of World War II began. He also had a reputation, I call her the tattoo lady, because she seemed to have had a penchant for prisoners who had interesting tattoos on them. And she would ride around camp on her horse, and she'd see a work detail working, and maybe some of the prisoners didn't have their shirts or jackets on, and she'd see somebody with a interesting tattoo, and so she'd ask the foreman of the group or an SS officer, I'd like to have that tattoo. And so the unfortunate gentleman would disappear, and these are some examples of some of the human skin tattoos that were found at the camp. She reportedly liked to have them made into household objects like album covers or slippers or lampshades or gloves, things of that sort. A very sick and sadistic woman. Here's another very elaborate piece of skin with amazing bit of artwork on it. Surprisingly enough, they were a very family-oriented group. Karl is there with their son Artvin, and Gisela was a daughter who came a couple of years later. They had a third child, another daughter, who died while Karl and Ilse were off on a vacation, and the nanny sent them a message that your daughter's very ill, you know, you must come home immediately. And they said, no, I don't think so. We're having too much fun here in the Mediterranean. And so they didn't come home, and their daughter died in infancy. Here's a shot. I love this picture. Here's Artvin, here's Karl, here's Ilse, and here's the Easter Bunny. And the SS guards are showing Artvin, you know, the cute little rabbit. You know, if you didn't know the context of this picture, you would think, well, this is a sweet little family tableau. But when you know the backstory, it isn't quite as sweet. I mentioned there was a zoo there, and here's Karl and Artvin feeding a deer at the zoo. It was a small zoo, only a few dozen animals, and it was basically there for the officers' families, the SS officers who lived at the camp, someplace where they could take their kids and spend a pleasant afternoon. There was a bear den there, and shot of 2 bear cubs playing. This is what's left of the bear den now, and as you can see, it's about 50 yards away from the crematorium. So any of the families who were going to the zoo for a pleasant day out were confronted with the crematorium. Talk a little bit about the SS guards and the psychology of terror. Heinrich Himmler, of course, was the head of the SS. The head of the guards at all of the concentration camps was an SS officer named Theodor Eicke. And here's a shot, some of the SS guards from Buchenwald on the Ettersberg. This structure behind them was called the Bismarck Turm. Bismarck was the Kaiser, the leader of Germany, who pushed for and got the unification of Germany in 1871. And so all over Germany, there were these monuments built to Bismarck. And this happens to be on the highest point of the Ettersberg, looking down over the city of Weimar. Before the camp was built, it was a place where families would go for a Sunday picnic, and had this wonderful view of the whole surrounding countryside. And that's where these folks are. We'll talk more about the Bismarck term later. Some of the ID card photos from some of the guards look like some real reputable guys. Eicke had a saying. He said, camp guards can only be the hardest men. Anyone who shows the slightest bit of compassion or friendliness to an inmate had best resign and move to a seminary. That was his kind of view on life. There were guard dogs at the camp that terrorized the inmates. This is the dog kennels that are still remaining at the camp. A guy named Martin Zomer, he was the chief jailer at Buchenwald. And if you can imagine, they had a prison within the camp that was separate from what was going on. This is the main gate, the main door is here. And this wing of the gatehouse was where the prison cells were. It was called der Bunker. And these are small cells where prisoners were sent for additional punishment or to spend their last night before they were executed the next day. These are some of Zomer's tools that he used to torture and sometimes kill inmates. This little wooden contraption is called a Bach, or the goat. And you can see here it's got an area where you put your 2 feet and they lock you in, bend you over, and then they whip the hell out of you. Particularly brutal piece of torture. Manfred, Karl's son from his first marriage, evidently mouthed off to Ilsa one day. She probably said, I want you to do this and that. And he said, you're not my mother, you can't tell me what to do. So his father, Karl, had him spend a night in the bunker with all of the other prisoners who were about to be killed. I can imagine it was a very traumatic incident. Basically, the inmates were slaves of the Nazi government. They were watched over from guard towers with machine guns day and night. Escape was virtually impossible. There were capos that were chosen from the inmate population, and basically what they were inmates who had special powers. The yellow star that he has on there indicates that he was Jewish, and most of the capos in many of the camps like Auschwitz, where there were a lot of Jews, were drawn from the prisoner population. Here we see a capo forcing prisoners to basically remain in what they call the Buchenwald crouch, where you were balancing on your 2 feet with your knees bent and your hands behind your head. If you fell over, you got beaten. He's got a club in his hand there, you can see. The diet was hardly anything you would feed your worst enemy or your dog. You got a slice of bread per meal. You might get 2 bowls of soup a day, which consisted of rotten vegetables, condemned meat, and other miscellaneous ingredients that nobody really knew what they were. It was basically, you were getting about 800 calories a day, about half of what a normal human being needs to survive. This is a view of the kitchen, where all of this yummy food was prepared in these big cauldrons. Here are some prisoners lined up to get their daily ration of soup. Here's somebody enjoying his meal. Didn't stay in you very long. This is a shot of one of the restrooms, washrooms, and there were some outdoor toilet facilities as well, if you craved the open air. As a result, prisoners were starving to death. You can see that these gentlemen had been reduced to living skeletons. There was another feature of the camp, and it was off in this corner here. It was called the Kleine Lager, or the little camp. And this is where prisoners, when they first brought in, they were brought in by the train loads. I mean, they were just hundreds, thousands at a time. And they were taken to the little camp. It was kind of a quarantine area. And so you stayed there for a period of time, maybe a week, maybe 2, maybe longer, until you were released into the general prisoner population if you didn't show any signs of disease that could spread. And typhus was a major problem in concentration camps. This is a shot of the barracks in the little camp. These were actually horse stables that were converted into barracks. Would hold somewhere around 800 men each. A shot of the little camp again, and this is kind of what the living conditions look like. 2, 3, 4 men to a bunk, straw mattresses, just awful conditions. In 1944, there was a group of Allied aviators, Americans and Canadians, who were captured after their planes were shot down, and they all ended up in Buchenwald, which should not have happened. They should have gone directly to a prisoner of war camp, but for some reason they ended up in Buchenwald for several weeks, and a few of them died while in captivity before they were then sent on to the regular POW camp. Work details, you getting 800 calories a day, or you can hardly put one foot in front of the other, and now you're going to go to work. So here we see some guys digging a ditch and people pushing some sort of carriage there to put the dirt in. Another shot of that. At Buchenwald, they built a road from the camp down to the town and it got the name of the Blood Road because so many prisoners died while making it. This is a shot of the railroad line that was also being put in between the train station in Weimar and the camp. This is the rail yard at Buchenwald, and a reverse angle shot of that area. This is still there. Many of the rail lines are still visible. Probably the worst place to work would be the quarry. This is where prisoners were forced to carry huge rocks on their shoulders and put them in the ore cars, and they'd be taken up, and you see one of the capos beating the prisoners because they're not working fast enough or because the load isn't big enough for them. Many men died in this environment. Another illustration of what that horror was like. If you're a really good prisoner, you got to work at a place like the armament factory that was there at the camp. You got to work indoors, and people weren't beating you as long as you did your job. They're making rifles here, it looks like. If you were a really bad prisoner, you got some severe punishment. Can you imagine being strung up with your arms behind you off of the ground for a period of who knows how long they were forced to stay in that position? And for those who didn't deserve to live, they got the gallows. This is the crematorium there. As you can see, the camp is fenced off with barbed wire that was electrified to cut down on escape attempts. If you weren't dead by the time you got to the crematorium, and they would beat you and then hang you up on hooks up by the ceiling in the basement of the crematorium. There were ovens there in which the corpses were burned. There were quite a few famous Europeans who were at one time or another incarcerated there. Konrad Adenauer, who was at that time the mayor of Cologne, who became the first chancellor of West Germany after the war. He was there. Leon Blum was the prime minister of France. You got the head of the Champagne Company, Chandon Moët, who was there. Edward Daladier was there. He was also a French prime minister. Just a number of people. If you're familiar with the von Stauffenberg attempt on Hitler's life, members of his family were sent there as well after von Stauffenberg was executed.
Were they all killed?
No, no. Like Adenauer, of course, he lived on, but most of these survived the war and their incarceration there. One that probably nobody knows or has ever heard of was Princess Mafalda. She was the daughter of the King of Italy, and you recall that Italy had been an ally of Germany, and her husband was a German officer stationed in Rome, and he was the art buyer in Italy for the Nazis. You know, if Goering wanted some paintings or Hitler wanted a statue, they went through Princess Mafalda's husband. Well, she became very anti-Nazi, and she became so vociferous that she was arrested and incarcerated at Buchenwald. One of the few women who were at Buchenwald.
And the children?
And the children stayed in Italy. I'm sure you're all familiar with the name Elie Wiesel, who was an anti-Nazi hunter, a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. This is him in one of the barracks shortly after liberation. You may not know this person from this photo, but if I put up this one, Robert Clary, Corporal LeBeau from Hogan's Heroes. And it had to be kind of spooky for him to be actually at Buchenwald and then play a role where he's a prisoner of war in a German prisoner of war camp. But he was quite a talented young man. He would sing and dance. I think he was about 10 or 12 when he was arrested and sent to Buchenwald. And he was such a popular kid that the other inmates did everything they could to protect him and keep him alive. In January 1941, something interesting happens. Karl Otto Koch gets himself in hot water. He has been skimming profits off of the camp, and money that should have gone to the SS is going to his and Ilse's personal bank account. So she's able to, you know, buy fine furs, and they get a nice car, and do all sorts of things. And the SS has found out about this, and this SS lawyer named Konrad Morgan becomes the chief investigator, kind of behind the scenes, and they start investigating him. Interestingly enough, he wasn't in trouble because of the mistreatment of the inmates, but for stealing money from the SS. And so when Morgan brings a case against Koch, Koch gets transferred to a new camp at Majdanek in Poland. A new commandant comes in named Hermann Pister, comes in shortly after Karl Otto Koch departs in January of 41. In July of 41, give you a little historical time frame here, Germany invades the Soviet Union. December 7th of 41, Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The U.S. is now in the war. But Buchenwald goes on. It was a place where many medical experiments took place using the inmates as human guinea pigs. These were some of the doctors who looked just like ordinary people. Yeah. Ding Schuler here, you know, you'd like to have him as your family doctor. Looks like a pleasant enough guy. So they would run these tests on prisoners, inject them with the typhus disease and see what happens to them, and did all sorts of horrible things. This gentleman down here, Edwin Ellenbogen, was actually an American citizen. I think he was born in Europe, and he came back to Europe about the time the war was breaking out, and he got arrested, and he ended up being a psychiatrist for many of the camp administrators. And you could imagine, you know, being, you know, your job is to abuse all of these inmates, and you might come out with a few psychological issues, and so they would confess to him, you know, how bad this made them feel, but felt that they had no choice but to keep doing it. Some of the experiments going on there, a couple of decapitated heads. The upper left one is a shrunken head. There were at least two there at the camp I've seen pictures of. And this was a laboratory where the cadavers would be on the slab here, and they'd be autopsied to see, you know, if they died from the disease that was implanted in them or whatever. And this is still there today. You can visit that room. Buchenwald also became a major industrial facility for the Third Reich. I think we all know the name Wernher von Braun, who was a rocket scientist, came to the U.S. After the war, helped us get to the moon. But he was also one of the main scientists working on the V2 rocket program. And Buchenwald becomes involved in the V2 program because there's this huge factory that's built there called Gustavwerk 2. And you can see some prisoners here. They're building one of the large buildings here. This was basically, they didn't make the whole rocket here, but they made components for the V2s at this place. Some of the workshops, interior view. While this is going on, the war is progressing. On June 6, 44, of course, is the Normandy landings, commonly known as the D-Day landings. And in August of 44, there's a U.S. Army Air Force air raid on Buchenwald. There was a prisoner who was able to escape, and he got to friendly lines, and he told whoever he was liberated by what was going on at Buchenwald. And it was very interesting the news about this Gustavwerk factory. And because V2s were becoming a problem, the US Air Force decided, let's do something about that. And so they sent a massive bombing raid against the camp to knock out the factory. In this view up here, those are some of the factory buildings. This is all factory buildings. And this is the prisoner enclosure here. You can see the photograph taken during the bombing raid that the whole factory gets obliterated. And it, basically, the factory never opened again. This is what that area looks like today. You can just find ruins of the foundations of the buildings. One of the homes on Officers Row was collapsed. This is basically Officers Row without the homes. Princess Mafalda, unfortunately, is killed in this air raid. One of the bombs fell close to the VIP section, and she was badly burned and did not survive her injuries. Remember, I've mentioned the Goethe oak, that Germany would stand for as long as the tree stood. Well, this is what the tree looks like today. Just the stump of the thing. There's a little plaque there that lets you know what that's there for. The SS, after the bombing raid, had a big funeral in the main cemetery at Weimar. You can see here in the front row are apparently the parents, relatives of the SS soldiers who were killed, and then rank after rank of SS officers, and behind them are the townspeople who all turned out for this funeral. And you can see over here on the left the SS guards and the graves. And the graves are still there. The wooden crosses have been replaced with stone crosses. There's nothing that says they were an SS soldier. It doesn't give you any information about that. But this is basically the same view before and after. 1945, the tide of the war turns. We have the Red Army moving in from the east. You got this map here that Mike brought down. You've got the Americans and the British and the Canadians and the French moving in from the west. This is a shot to show you where Auschwitz is down in southwestern Poland. Weimar is here, and Germany is being squeezed from both sides. The Soviets liberated Auschwitz on January 27th, 1945, my wife's birthday. And I should say too that before then, this was really the first death camp that was liberated, and the world finally got an idea of what was going on in some of these camps. There were 6 major death camps, all of them in Poland. Weimar gets bombed in February of 45. This is the town square. You can see did quite a bit of damage down there. What happens to Karl Otto Koch? Well, I mentioned that he was convicted of improprieties with SS funds. About 3 weeks before the camp is liberated, he is brought back to Buchenwald, and he faces an SS firing squad, and he is executed on the 3rd of April. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army is pushing towards Weimar, and you can see in this map we have showing you where the British and the Americans were going. Weimar's kind of in the middle. And this is a close-up of the Weimar area. Buchenwald's here. There's a little town here called Ohrdruf, and Ohrdruf had one of the sub-camps of Buchenwald. And the Americans are rolling along. Nobody has told them anything about concentration camps. There have been no lectures. There have been no mimeographed memos. There's been nothing to say, if you run into a concentration camp, here's what you do. Here's what you don't do. The whole idea, I guess, it was a shock to the system of the Americans who stumbled across these things. And so I say, what do American troops know about the concentration camps? Basically nothing. Even though in July, May, and whatever the other date is up there, April of 1933, there are articles in the New York Times about how the Nazis are persecuting Jews, but a lot of people don't, you don't remember that. When you go into the army, you're not, schooled in that. You're taught how to shoot and use a bayonet and drive a Jeep and all of that. You're not thinking that someday you're going to come across a camp where people have been rounded up and incarcerated. So the advanced elements get to Ohrdruf on April 4th, day after Koch is killed, and they come across just thousands of dead bodies lying all over the place. Well, the commanding officer of the unit that got there first radios back to headquarters, and he said, you got to send some people here. You won't believe what we found. So here's Eisenhower, Bradley, and this guy is Walton Walker. He was 20th Corps commander, and they all show up at Ohrdruf a couple days after the camp has been discovered, and they're shown how prisoners were tortured on the Bach. Remember, I showed you that picture. There's Patton was with them, Bradley and Eisenhower. They're being told how prisoners were abused and murdered there. This was a crematorium pit, I guess you'd call it. They didn't have I think they had a building, but it wasn't enough to handle all of the corpses, and so many of the prisoners were incinerated outside on these railroad tracks. The Americans say, well, we need to let people in town know about this, and so the commanding officer of the division that got there ordered civilians to tour the camp and see what had been going on. And Eisenhower famously said, it's been said that our soldiers don't know what they're fighting for. Maybe now they'll know what they're fighting against. And he instructed all units in Europe who were nearby and weren't engaged in direct combat to come and see what the concentration camps are all about. Well, as the Allies are getting closer to the camps, the Nazis don't want to have these camps fall into the hands of the Allies, so they send their prisoners out on marches across the road, basically marches to oblivion. There was really no intent of what to do with them, other than hopefully they'll all die while marching, when they're not given any food and they have to march 12, 16 hours a day. This is a shot of me in one of the villages near Weimar. This shows, where am I? Weimar is here, Buchenwald is here, and it shows the routes that the prisoners were sent on these death marches. And this is a memorial to them so that people wouldn't forget what went on. Those who died by the side of the road sometimes were just left there, some were buried. Here are some American soldiers digging up some of the corpses. And just in Eastern Germany, just, the highways, the roads going through the countryside were just lined with dead bodies during the death march period. Liberation for Buchenwald comes on April 11th of 45. We have the 3rd Army, 6th Armored Division is part of that. Here's Ohrdruf down here, Weimar, and Buchenwald. And 6th Armored Division is heading right towards Weimar. They have no idea that Buchenwald is there. Not marked on any military maps of the time. A gentleman, he was a captain, there's a picture of him as a lieutenant, named Fred Keffer. He was in a 5 or 6 man advance patrol heading towards Weimar, and I think they had like a couple of armored vehicles. And they get to the outskirts and they engage in a firefight with the SS. The camp has heard firing going on, and They know that the Allies are closing in on them, and so the SS tries to stop them, and the SS is overwhelmed by Keffer's small group. And they get to the camp, and they find that the prisoners have armed themselves. For years, they've been storing stolen German weapons and ammunition underneath barracks and in various other spots. And when the prisoners hear all this firing going on to the west of the camp, that's the time they break out the weapons and they overwhelm their guards at the main gate here. And at one point I saw something that said this is the first self-liberated concentration camp because of the heroism of the guards. They're very happy when Fred Keffer and his men arrive. Keffer radios back to higher headquarters. You can't believe what we found here. Send medical personnel, get here as quickly as possible. And the Americans, as they arrive, they tour the camp, the squalor of the camp. Some of the inmates have painted signs on the buildings. The German political prisoners welcome their American friends. The guys in the barracks who can barely walk are very happy at this moment. Here's some of the GIs out in front of the main gate. The GIs were given tours of the camp by some of the inmates. This fellow in the striped shirt is showing them the gallows where many prisoners were hung. The first Jewish religious service was held in the theater at the camp, and you see a rabbi there in the lower left conducting this service. This is the crematorium as it looks today. When they got there on the left, there was a pile of bones, burned bones, and here are thousands of gold wedding rings that were taken off of the inmates. Yes, sir?
Do you know why the crematorium still stands when most everything else is torn down?
Yes.
Because at Birkenau and Auschwitz, they tore them down.
Right. It was kept as a memorial, and I'll talk a little bit about what happened to the camp, after the war was over, which directly relates to that question. But they took the gold rings and watches and other jewelry off of the prisoners when they arrived, and presumably this was going to be melted down and turned into gold bars that Carl and Ilsa would put in their bank account. There were still stacks of bodies lying around the camp. This is outside the crematorium. The crematorium had run out of fuel, and so they weren't able to burn all of the bodies that were there, but it was left as evidence as to what was going on there. At the upper left, you see the inmates getting fumigated to kill the lice. I think it's probably a DDT type of spray that they're getting to cut down on the likelihood of typhus. A setting here, a hospital setting where American medics and nurses and doctors came in to try and help the inmates get back to health. We have somebody from Windsor, Colorado, who was at Buchenwald, a nurse named Lila Morrison. I'll read this for you. Lila Morrison served as a nurse with the 118th Evac Hospital as a fellow fighting across Western Europe and cared for wounded soldiers after the Normandy invasion and the Battle of the Bulge, and for the sick and starving inmates of the liberated Buchenwald Concentration Camp. And down here we have some camp money. There was a little canteen or PX where the inmates, if they were good, they could go and buy cigarettes or candy or something like that. And a fork that was from the Gustav Werk II factory, from the mess hall there. So we have these two artifacts from Buchenwald upstairs at the museum. Of course, the prisoners are just overjoyed. Those who can celebrate do so. There were a number of children there, several hundred children. And here we see the children being led out. This little guy here in front, he would become the chief rabbi of Israel in the 60s. And kids were put on trains, and I'm not sure where they sent them, but probably to refugee centers where they could recover from their traumatic experiences, if they ever could recover. On April 16th, 5 days after the camp was liberated, Patton shows up there, and boy is he mad. He gets there, he's already seen Ohrdruf. He's thrown up at Ohrdruf. It was so horrible. And he comes up, he gets a tour of Buchenwald, and he says, you know, the citizens of Weimar need to know what was going on up there. They claim they didn't know anything. And so he gave out orders for 1,000 citizens of Weimar to show up at the railroad station on the 16th and be prepared for a long hike and a long day. And so they march up the highway 5 miles to the top of the Ettersberg, and they enter the camp here. And you can see they're dressed in their, you know, Sunday best. Not sure what they're going to see. And this is a dummy that's hanging from the scaffold. And so they have groups of inmates who are taking them through, showing them the various aspects of the camp. This is a corpse wagon that was outside of the crematorium, and they're being told, you know, what this is all about. Close-up of the wagon. The German-speaking American officer telling them about the crematorium and the ovens. They were shown a table full of artifacts of objects, organs, things of that. Remove here a couple of shrunken heads, and we've got pieces of the tattooed skin, a lamp made from human skin, a lampshade, and the people from Weimar were not spared anything. You can see this one woman, she can't even look at it anymore. The guy behind her is kind of like, I don't want to see this, and he's looking off into the distance. Eisenhower told General Marshall, the chief of staff, about what was at Buchenwald, and said, you know, you got to send over some newspaper and magazine editors and Congress people, get them over here so they can see, and so nobody can ever deny that this took place. And so the newspaper editors and magazine editors showed up. You can see them taking notes here. There's a congressman looking at the corpses outside of the crematorium. There were trials, you know, in case you think that this is all swept under the rug. There were trials, and on April 11th, 1947, exactly 2 years after Buchenwald was liberated, a trial was held at Dachau. This is the officers' mess at Dachau, where that was turned into a courtroom. And this is where the 31 people with a connection to Dachau were put on trial. I think 31 out of the, you know, couple thousand who worked there. That's all they could find. But here you see him in the, I don't know, we call it the docket, whatever. They all have numbers on. Here's a fellow testifying before the court martial. Waldemar Hoven, I showed you this picture earlier. He's one of the doctors at Buchenwald. He was also Ilse Koch's lover. He and Ilse were having an affair. Hoven is hanged the next year. Hermann Piester, the second commandant, dies of a heart attack before he can be hanged. And what about our chief perpetrator here, Ilse? Here we see her with the group of other accused. She's
so good.
not looking real hot. And she's given life in prison on August 12th, 47. Her sentence is commuted after just serving 26 months. There was at this time, 1948, 1949, the Allies, Americans, British, and French, were having some difficulties with the Russians. The Cold War had really settled in, and there was a feeling in Germany that by continuing to prosecute people accused of war crimes or holding them for long sentences was counterproductive to the political situation in Germany at that time. And there was a feeling that the general German populace were getting very irritated by this. And so a lot of convicted war criminals were let go or had their sentences reduced. Ilsa is one of those who gets out of prison early, but she's almost immediately rearrested by the West Germans and put on trial again. You see down here a piece of a tattooed skin, and this time she's also found guilty again, and she's again sentenced to life in prison. Well, she goes to the Eichach women's prison in Germany, and she's there for a few years. She has an affair with another prisoner. I think somebody worked in the kitchen or something, and she has a child. And this is the best picture I could find of him. His name is Uwe Kohler, her maiden name. And so many years after he's born, he finds out that she's his mother, and he comes and visits her on the weekly visitation, and she writes him poetry, and he brings her candy or whatever. And but she finally just can't take imprisonment anymore, and so she commits suicide while in prison. And this was in 1967. Marianne and I visited the cemetery at Eichach to see if her grave was still there, but I think there's a situation in European cemeteries that somebody has to pay for the upkeep of the grave, and if you don't do that, then you get hauled out of there, and somebody else gets buried there. And the cemetery administrator didn't seem to know where her remains were. Maybe he wasn't telling. But for all purposes, she's no longer with us in any form. How did the city of Weimar and the East German government memorialize the 56,000 people who died there? Earlier I mentioned the Bismarck's Turm, the tower on top of the Ettersberg Hill. It was replaced by a new tower in the 1950s. And the East Germans built this huge memorial, and this is the largest memorial to the Holocaust anywhere in the world. I took a few pictures of that. It's really a solemn and somber place. This is a pit where the ashes of cremated prisoners were reburied. You can see there's a lot of sculpture around this park. Here's the new clock tower, or actually it's a bell tower, and the bronze statues in front of it. In 2015, I went over for the 70th anniversary commemoration, and this was quite a media event, as you might imagine, outside of the main gate. This young lady here, that's Helen Patton, General Patton's granddaughter, and she was there at this ceremony. The man on the left was a Jewish survivor of Buchenwald with his son. His son lives in, well, I think both of them live in Poland now. They were living in Israel for a while, and I chatted with them for some time. And then people started showing up with flags and flowers. This gentleman was in probably a replica of his camp uniform, but you can see that the flowers and the flags were quite prolific. And there was a ceremony, and speeches were given in a number of different languages. The crematorium is still there. And in one of the areas where the barracks once stood are these memorial stones with the name of a concentration camp engraved in it. And you can see that people have left the little pebbles on top of the stones as a remembrance of all those who lost their lives there. And I think I come away from this, with the phrase that we hear a lot when it comes to the Holocaust: never again. I kind of worry about what's happening in our country. We didn't think, that things like this could ever happen here, but with the current outbreak of hate that's taking place in certain parts of our country over various and sundry reasons, I think we all need to stay vigilant so that it can't ever happen again, and especially not here. I have copies of the Buchenwald trilogy here in case you're interested in picking up one or more of them. But I thank you for your attention very much. And if anybody has some questions, Dave? Well, there was one particular, Ravensbrück, which is a women's camp in northern Germany. That was more the exception. Yeah, yeah. But it was mostly the men who were rounded up and incarcerated. Yeah, Princess Mafalda was one of the very few women who were incarcerated. Yes, ma'am. The question is, do the people in Germany and in the U.S. really not know what was going on? I think they all knew, especially in Germany, because, for example, when Weimar was bombed in February of '45, they took inmates in their striped pajamas out from the camp to help repair the damage in town. So people saw them coming in, they saw them working.
They saw what the condition was too.
But they never knew all the details of what was going on. Yes.
There also was a Red Cross camp. There was a Red Cross camp that the Germans, it became the, what was allowed for the journalists to go and visit, and also the politicians to go and visit. And that was what the Germans showed the world. They never had any access to.
Yeah, it was a camp to say, look, we just have them in nice barracks. They have clean bedding, clean uniforms, good food, but it was just this one camp that was used to fool everybody else. Bud?
I was in and out, so I didn't hear if after the liberation, when the Soviets took over, didn't the Soviets use Buchenwald as a political prisoner?
Buchenwald became a camp that the Soviets kept their political prisoners in. I don't think it was, the conditions were as horrible as it was during the war or in the 1930s, but it was a way of taking, let's see, ex-Nazis, throwing them in prison, or people who, were against the communist regime, throwing them in prison. And so it went on for several years afterwards, yeah. Colonel?
Well, being an old guy, I remember seeing pictures in Life magazines, much like you showed here, well before the war was over. So, to including the hanging of nude people. You didn't show any of the nudes, but, so I would say people knew, they just didn't want to recognize it.
Yeah, there's in my research, the Sulzberger family were the publishers of the New York Times, And after World War I, there were a lot of false stories about German atrocities committed particularly towards Belgians and some French. And after the war, it was discovered that they were false, that these atrocities didn't happen, or at least not in the extent that they were being reported in the New York Times and other media. And so the Salzburgers were, people would assume that this was hate-mongering towards Germans. Oh, here they go again, the Salzburgers trying to drum up support for the Jewish people of